The rain pounded against the windows of Ravenshollow Castle like angry fists demanding entry. Lady Margaret Whitmore pressed her face against the cold glass, watching the storm tear through the English countryside with a fury that matched the chaos in her own heart. She had nowhere else to go. Her carriage had broken down on the muddy road. Her driver had fled into the night, and now she stood at the gates of the most feared man in all of Yorkshire. Lord Adrian Blackthorne, the Duke of Ravenshollow. They called him the Shadow Duke, a man who had lost his wife and child in a fire that consumed half his estate 3 years ago. Since then, he had become a ghost, haunting his own castle, refusing visitors, turning away even the boldest of suitors who dared approach his lands. But Margaret had no choice. The storm was getting worse, and she could see no other shelter for miles. When the massive oak doors finally creaked open, Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. The man standing before her was nothing like the monster the village gossips described. Yes, his dark hair was disheveled, and yes, his clothes were wrinkled as if he had been drinking alone in his study again. But his eyes, oh, his eyes were the deepest shade of emerald she had ever seen, and they held a pain so raw it made her chest ache. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, like gravel against silk. He stepped into the doorway, blocking her view of the grand hallway beyond. "Please, Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "My carriage broke down on the main road. I have nowhere else to go until morning." Adrian studied her face in the flickering candlelight. She was beautiful, this unexpected visitor. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins during her desperate walk through the storm, and her blue eyes sparkled with unshed tears. She looked nothing like Elizabeth, his beloved wife who had perished in the flames. And perhaps that was why he found himself stepping aside. "You will stay only one night," he said firmly, his jaw clenched as if the words caused him physical pain. "One night, and then you leave. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded quickly, relief flooding through her as she stepped into the warmth of the castle. She had no idea that this single night would change both their lives forever. The castle was magnificent, even in its current state of neglect. Dust covered the elegant furniture, and cobwebs hung from the crystal chandeliers like abandoned dreams. But Margaret could see the beauty beneath the decay, the love that had once filled these halls. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you to a room," Adrian said curtly, gesturing to an elderly woman who appeared from the shadows like a wraith. "Dinner will be served at 8. Do not expect conversation." As Margaret followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase, she caught glimpses of portraits lining the walls. Generations of Blackthornes stared down at her with those same piercing green eyes. But it was the portrait at the top of the stairs that made her pause. A beautiful woman with golden hair and laughing blue eyes stood beside a younger version of Adrian. They were both smiling, their hands intertwined, a small child between them. "That was the Duchess Elizabeth," Mrs. Pemberton whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow, "and little Thomas. They died in the fire that took the East Wing. His Grace, he has never been the same." Margaret's heart clenched with sympathy. She understood loss, perhaps better than most. Her own parents had died when she was barely 18, leaving her with nothing but debts and a crumbling estate. She had been on her way to London to find work as a governess when the storm struck. The room Mrs. Pemberton led her to was beautiful. Despite its obvious neglect, a four-poster bed dominated the space, draped in deep blue velvet that had once been rich and luxurious. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I've laid out some clothes that might fit you, miss," Mrs. Pemberton said kindly. "They belonged to the Duchess. His Grace," he said, "you might need them, seeing as yours are soaked through." Margaret touched the elegant green silk dress that had been placed on the bed. It was exquisite, clearly expensive, and it made her feel strange to think of wearing another woman's clothes. But her own dress was indeed ruined by the rain, and she had nothing else. When she made her way down to the dining room that evening, she found Adrian waiting for her. He had changed into formal evening wear, his dark hair now neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. The transformation was startling. He looked every inch the powerful duke he was supposed to be. "The dress suits you," he said quietly, his eyes lingering on her face longer than was proper. "Thank you for your kindness, Your Grace," Margaret replied, taking her seat at the far end of the enormous dining table. The distance between them felt like a chasm. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the clinking of silverware against china and the storm still raging outside. But Margaret found herself stealing glances at her mysterious host. There was something about him that drew her, despite his obvious desire to remain distant. "Why were you traveling alone?" Adrian asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Margaret set down her fork carefully. "I am going to London to seek employment, Your Grace. I have no family left, and my estate, it was lost to creditors. A lady of your obvious breeding working as a governess." There was something in his tone that might have been sympathy. "Pride does not pay debts, Your Grace," Margaret said, with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And I have learned that survival matters more than social standing." Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her with those intense green eyes. "You speak like someone who has known real hardship." "As do you, Your Grace." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Adrian's jaw tightened, and for a moment Margaret thought he might order her from the room. Instead, he surprised her. "Tell me about your family," he said softly. So she did. Margaret found herself speaking of her childhood, of parents who had loved her deeply but managed their finances poorly. She told him about the creditors who had come like vultures after the funeral, stripping away everything she had ever known. She spoke of loneliness, of fear, of the desperate hope that had driven her toward London. And as she spoke, something shifted in Adrian's expression. The harsh lines around his eyes softened slightly. His shoulders lost some of their rigid tension. "You are very brave," he said when she finished. "I am very stubborn," Margaret corrected with a laugh that was only slightly bitter. "There is a difference." "Is there?" Adrian asked, and for the first time since she had arrived, she thought she saw the ghost of a smile on his lips. The evening passed more quickly than either of them expected. They moved from the dining room to the library, where Adrian surprised her by offering her brandy. Margaret accepted, and they sat before the fire, the storm still howling outside, but somehow feeling less threatening now. "You said I could stay only one night," Margaret said eventually, turning to face him in her chair. Adrian stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "Yes. Why?" He was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I cannot bear to lose anyone else." The raw honesty in his words made Margaret's chest tighten. Without thinking, she moved from her chair to the sofa where he sat, close enough that she could see the pain etched in every line of his face. "Tell me about them," she said gently. And so he did. Adrian spoke of Elizabeth, his childhood sweetheart, whom he had married when they were both barely 20. He told her about their son Thomas, who had inherited his mother's laugh and his father's stubborn streak. He described the night of the fire, how he had been away on business, how he had returned to find half his castle in flames and his world destroyed. "I should have been here," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have protected them." "You could not have known," Margaret said softly, and before she could think better of it, she reached out and placed her hand over his. The contact sent electricity shooting through both of them. Adrian stared down at their joined hands, his breathing shallow. Margaret knew she should pull away, knew that touching him like this was improper, dangerous even, but she could not bring herself to break the connection. "You should go to bed," Adrian said finally, though he made no move to pull his hand away from hers. "Should I?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," he said. But his eyes said something entirely different. They sat there for several more minutes, the fire crackling between them, the storm beginning to calm outside. Finally, Margaret stood, her hand slipping from his. "Good night, Your Grace," she said softly. "Adrian," he said, looking up at her with those devastating green eyes, "my name is Adrian." "Good night, Adrian." Margaret made her way up the stairs, slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel his eyes on her back, could sense the tension that had sprung up between them like a living thing. When she reached her room, she closed the door and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. What was happening to her? She barely knew this man, this duke who lived like a hermit in his crumbling castle. But something about him called to her, something beyond his obvious pain and loneliness. There was a strength in him, a goodness that he tried to hide behind his cold exterior. Margaret changed into the nightgown Mrs. Pemberton had provided and climbed into the enormous bed, but sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Adrian's face, saw the way he had looked at her when she touched his hand. She could still feel the warmth of his skin against hers, could still hear the raw emotion in his voice when he spoke of his lost family. Sometime after midnight, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. They paused for a moment, and Margaret held her breath, wondering if Adrian might knock. But after several seconds, the footsteps continued down the hall, and she heard a door close in the distance. He was thinking about her too. The thought sent a thrill through her that she tried to suppress. Morning came too soon, pale sunlight streaming through the windows to announce the end of the storm. Margaret dressed quickly in her own clothes, which Mrs. Pemberton had dried and mended during the night. She made her way downstairs, expecting to find Adrian waiting to hurry her on her way. Instead, she found the dining room empty, except for Mrs. Pemberton, who was setting a single place at the table. "Where is His Grace?" Margaret asked. "Gone out to survey the storm damage, miss," the housekeeper replied with a sympathetic look. He asked me to tell you that a carriage has been arranged to take you to the next village." Margaret felt her heart sink. Of course, he had said one night, and he meant it. Whatever she thought had passed between them the evening before had been nothing more than her imagination. "I see," she said quietly. "Please tell His Grace that I am grateful for his hospitality." Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, then leaned closer. "If I may say so, miss, you've done him good. I haven't seen him smile in 3 years, not until last night, and he did smile, miss. I saw it when he thought no one was looking. But it did not matter," Margaret told herself as she gathered her few belongings. She had known this was temporary. She had known she would leave this morning and probably never see Adrian again. The thought should not have caused such a sharp pain in her chest. The carriage that arrived to take her away was modest but comfortable. As Margaret climbed inside, she took one last look at Ravenshollow Castle. It looked less forbidding in the morning light, more like a sleeping giant than a haunted fortress. She found herself memorizing every detail, knowing she would never see it again. But as the carriage pulled away, she caught a glimpse of a figure standing at one of the upstairs windows. Even at a distance, she could see those piercing green eyes watching her leave. Adrian had returned, and he was letting her go. The journey to London took 3 days, but Margaret barely noticed the passing countryside. Her thoughts kept returning to the castle, to the man who lived there like a ghost among his memories. She told herself she was being foolish, that she had imagined the connection between them, but she could not forget the way he had looked at her, the way his hand had felt beneath hers. London was everything she had expected, and nothing she wanted. The city was loud and dirty and overwhelming after the quiet beauty of Yorkshire. The employment agency found her a position quickly enough. Governess to the twin daughters of a wealthy merchant who cared more about appearances than his children's actual education. The Thornfield house was grand but cold, all marble and gilt with no warmth or personality. Margaret's room was small and austere, befitting her status as an employee rather than a guest. The children, Lucy and Sarah, were sweet but neglected, hungry for attention their parents rarely provided. Margaret threw herself into her work, teaching the girls their letters and numbers, reading them stories, taking them for walks in Hyde Park. But even as she built routines and began to care for her young charges, part of her remained in Yorkshire, in a crumbling castle with a man who had haunted his own halls. Weeks passed, then months. Margaret told herself she was settling into her new life, that she was content with her lot. But late at night, when the house was quiet and she lay alone in her narrow bed, she found herself thinking of emerald eyes and a voice rough with pain. She began having dreams about Adrian. Dreams where he smiled more freely, where the shadows in his eyes cleared. Dreams where he held her hand, not in grief, but in joy. She would wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest that seemed to grow stronger each day. It was Mrs. Thornfield who noticed her distraction first. "Miss Whitmore," the woman said sharply one morning when Margaret had let the girls' breakfast grow cold while staring out the window. "Your mind seems to be elsewhere lately. I hope you are not finding our household insufficient for your needs." "Not at all, Mrs. Thornfield," Margaret replied quickly. "I apologize. I was merely thinking about lesson plans." But it was not lesson plans that occupied her thoughts. It was the memory of a man who had said she could stay only one night, but had somehow claimed a permanent place in her heart. Spring arrived in London with little fanfare. The city became marginally less grey, and the parks filled with flowers, but Margaret found no joy in the changing season. If anything, the awakening world around her only emphasized how dead she felt inside. It was on a particularly lovely April morning that everything changed. Margaret was walking with Lucy and Sarah in Hyde Park when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Miss Margaret?" She turned, her heart nearly stopping at the sight of Mrs. Pemberton hurrying toward her, looking harried and worried. "Mrs. Pemberton," Margaret exclaimed, momentarily forgetting her charges in her surprise. "What are you doing in London?" The elderly housekeeper was breathing hard, as if she had been running. "Miss, thank goodness I found you. I've been searching for days. I remembered you said you were coming to London to be a governess, and I've been asking at every agency, every household. What is wrong?" Margaret asked, her stomach clenching with sudden fear. "Is his Grace well?" Mrs. Pemberton's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, miss, he's terrible. Just terrible. Ever since you left, he's been like a man possessed. He barely eats, barely sleeps. He spends all his time in the library, staring at the chair where you sat that night. And yesterday—" "What happened yesterday?" Margaret demanded. "He collapsed, miss. Right there in the entrance hall where he first met you. The doctor says it's exhaustion and heartbreak. He keeps asking for you, miss, calling your name in his sleep." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. He's asking for me?" "Oh yes, miss. He told me before I left. He said he was a fool to let you go, that he's been dying slowly ever since. He begged me to find you, to ask you to come back. He says he loves you, miss. Has loved you since that first night. but he was too frightened to admit it. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, reaching out to steady herself on a nearby tree. Adrian loved her. The proud, wounded Duke of Ravenshollow loved her, and was literally making himself sick with grief. "I have to go to him," Margaret said, her voice fierce with sudden determination. "But miss, what about your position here? Your employer?" Margaret looked at Lucy and Sarah, who were staring up at her with wide, curious eyes. These sweet children deserved better than parents who ignored them, and a governess whose heart was hundreds of miles away. "I will explain to Mrs. Thornfield," Margaret said. "She can find another governess easily enough. But Adrian, there is only one Adrian, and I cannot let him suffer when I have the power to ease his pain." Mrs. Pemberton smiled through her tears. "Oh, Missy will be so happy. I have a coach waiting. We can leave within the hour if you can be ready." "I can be ready," Margaret said without hesitation. The conversation with Mrs. Thornfield was as unpleasant as expected. The woman was furious at Margaret's sudden departure, threatening to spread word about her unreliability throughout London society. But Margaret found she did not care. Let them talk. She had spent months trying to build a life without love, and she could not bear another day of it. The journey back to Yorkshire felt endless. Mrs. Pemberton filled the hours with stories of Adrian's decline, each tale making Margaret's heart ache more. He had dismissed most of the servants, she learned, keeping only Mrs. Pemberton and a skeleton staff. He had stopped receiving visitors entirely, not even bothering to respond to invitations or business correspondence. "He's wasting away, Mrs. Pemberton said sadly, "like he's trying to will himself to die. I've never seen anything like it." Margaret stared out the carriage window at the passing countryside, her hands clenched in her lap. She should have known. Should have realized that what had passed between them that single night was real, powerful, transformative. She had been a coward to run away to London instead of staying to fight for what they both wanted. But she was not running now. When Ravenshollow Castle finally came into view, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The place looked even more desolate than before, if such a thing were possible. Several windows were boarded up, the gardens were completely overgrown, and the whole estate had an air of abandonment that made her chest tighten with alarm. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. "It started about a month after you left, miss." He just stopped caring, stopped trying to maintain anything. The carriage pulled up to the front entrance, and Margaret climbed out on unsteady legs. The massive oak doors looked even more forbidding than she remembered, and when Mrs. Pemberton pushed them open, the entrance hall beyond was dim and cold. "Where is he?" Margaret asked. "The library, miss. He spends all his time there now." Margaret made her way through the castle's shadowy corridors, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. When she reached the library door, she paused, her hand on the handle. What if Mrs. Pemberton was wrong? What if Adrian did not want to see her after all? But then she heard it, a sound that made her heart break. Someone was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that spoke of a grief too profound for words. Margaret pushed open the door and stepped inside. Adrian was sprawled in the chair where they had sat together that first night, but he was barely recognizable. His hair was long and unkempt, his face gaunt and pale. His clothes hung loose on his frame, as if he had lost a dangerous amount of weight. But it was his eyes that shocked her most. Those beautiful green eyes were dull and lifeless, staring at nothing. "Adrian," she whispered. His head snapped up at the sound of her voice, and for a moment Margaret thought he might be hallucinating. He blinked several times, as if trying to clear his vision. "Margaret?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Yes," she said, stepping closer. "I'm here." Adrian stared at her for several long seconds, his breathing shallow and rapid. Then, without warning, he surged to his feet and crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that took her breath away. "You came back," he said, his voice breaking as he buried his face in her hair. "You came back to me." "I never should have left," Margaret whispered, her own tears falling freely now. "I was a fool, Adrian, such a fool." They held each other in the middle of that dusty library as if they were drowning and each other was their only salvation. Margaret could feel how thin Adrian had become, could hear the rapid beating of his heart against her cheek. He was trembling, his whole body shaking with emotion. "I thought I had lost you forever," he said, pulling back to look at her face. "I thought you were gone, and I could not bear it. I tried to live without you, but I felt like I was already dead." Margaret reached up to cup his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away the tears that were streaming down his cheeks. "You will never lose me," she said fiercely. "Never. I love you, Adrian. I have loved you since that first night. But I was too frightened to stay, and I was too frightened to ask you to," he admitted. I thought if I let myself love you, I would lose you too, like I lost Elizabeth and Thomas. I thought it would be easier to let you go than to risk that pain again. But pushing me away hurt just as much, didn't it?" Margaret asked gently. Adrian laughed, but it was a broken sound. "More. It hurt more, because I chose it. Because I threw away the greatest gift I had ever been given out of fear." "Then let us choose differently now," Margaret said, standing on her tiptoes to press her forehead against his. "Let us choose love over fear. Let us choose each other." "I do choose you," Adrian said, his voice strong and clear for the first time since she had arrived. "I choose you, Margaret Whitmore, for tonight, for tomorrow, for every day that I have left in this world, if you will have me." "Yes," Margaret said, her heart soaring. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Adrian kissed her then, and it was like coming home after a long, dark journey. His lips were soft and warm against hers, and she could taste the salt of his tears mixed with her own. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Marry me," Adrian said suddenly. "Marry me, Margaret. I know I have nothing to offer you but a crumbling castle and a broken man." "Yes," Margaret interrupted, laughing through her tears. "Yes. You ridiculous man. Do you think I care about castles? Do you think I came back here for your estate? Then why?" Adrian asked, his eyes searching her face. "Why did you come back?" "Because you are my home," Margaret said simply. "Because when I am with you, I am complete. Because I would rather spend one more night in your arms than a lifetime anywhere else." Adrian kissed her again, more gently this time, his hands tangling in her hair. "You said I could stay only one night," Margaret whispered against his lips. "I was wrong," Adrian said, his voice rough with emotion. "One night could never be enough. I want 1,000 nights with you. 10,000. I want forever." "Forever sounds perfect," Margaret agreed. And as they stood there in that dusty library, holding each other like they would never let go, Margaret knew that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with a single night of shelter from the storm. She had thought she was only seeking refuge from the rain, but instead she had found her heart's true home. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small chapel on the castle grounds. Margaret wore Elizabeth's wedding dress, which Mrs. Pemberton had carefully altered, and she carried wildflowers from the castle gardens that Adrian had personally tended back to life. It was a small ceremony, just the two of them, Mrs. Pemberton, the village priest, and a handful of local servants, who had returned once word spread that the Duke was himself again. But as Margaret walked down the aisle toward the man she loved, She felt like the richest woman in the world. Adrian was waiting for her at the altar, and he looked magnificent. He had regained the weight he had lost. His hair was neatly trimmed, and his green eyes were bright with joy and anticipation. "You are so beautiful," he whispered when she reached his side. "As are you," she whispered back, making him smile. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. When they exchanged vows, both of them spoke from the heart, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever storms might come. And when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian kissed his bride with such tenderness that even Mrs. Pemberton was moved to tears. "I love you, Margaret Blackthorne," Adrian said against her lips. "And I love you, husband," Margaret replied, marveling at how natural the word sounded. The celebration that followed was small but joyful. Mrs. Pemberton had prepared a feast despite having minimal staff, and even the servants seemed lighter and happier than they had in years. The castle itself seemed to come alive again, as if love had breathed new life into its ancient stones. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed in what was now their shared chamber, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. If someone had told her a year ago that she would be a duchess, married to a man she adored, living in a castle that was slowly being restored to its former glory, she would have laughed at the impossibility of it all. But here she was, wearing a silk nightgown that Adrian had given her as a wedding gift, her hair loose around her shoulders, waiting for her husband to join her. When Adrian entered the room, he stopped in the doorway, just looking at her. He had changed into a simple white shirt and dark trousers, and his hair was still slightly damp from washing. He looked younger somehow, the lines of pain around his eyes softened by happiness. "Are you nervous?" he asked gently, clearly remembering that this was her first wedding night. Margaret considered the question. She should be nervous, she supposed. She was an innocent, and despite the intimacy they had shared in conversation and gentle kisses, they had not yet consummated their relationship. But as she looked at this man who loved her so completely, she felt only anticipation. "No," she said, truthfully. "I am not nervous. I am eager." Adrian's eyes darkened at her words, and he moved toward her slowly, as if she were a wild creature he did not want to startle. "We have all the time in the world," he said, reaching out to touch her cheek. "We need not rush anything." "I know," Margaret said, leaning into his touch, "but I have waited long enough to truly be yours. I do not want to wait any longer." What followed was a night of gentle passion and tender discovery. Adrian was patient and loving, introducing Margaret to the pleasures of married life with a care that brought tears to her eyes. And when they finally lay entwined in each other's arms, both breathless and sated, Margaret knew that she had found her purpose in life. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes," Adrian confessed, stroking her hair as she lay with her head on his chest. "It does not frighten me," Margaret said, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "It makes me feel alive." The months that followed were like something out of a fairy tale. Adrian threw himself into restoring the castle with an energy that amazed everyone who knew him. He hired craftsmen to repair the damaged east wing, gardeners to restore the grounds, and servants to bring life back to the empty halls. Margaret proved to be a natural chatelaine, organizing the household with an efficiency that impressed even Mrs. Pemberton. She also threw herself into charitable work in the village, using her position as Duchess to help families in need and improve conditions for the local workers. But perhaps most importantly, she helped Adrian heal from the grief that had consumed him for so long. She did not try to replace Elizabeth and Thomas in his heart. That would have been impossible and wrong. Instead, she helped him find a way to honor their memory while still embracing the future. They established a school in the village in Thomas's name, and they had Elizabeth's portrait moved to a place of honor in the main hall, where her warm smile could welcome visitors to their home. It was Margaret's idea, and when Adrian saw it, he wept. Not with grief this time, but with gratitude. "You have given me permission to remember them with joy instead of just pain," he told her that night. "I did not think such a thing was possible." "Love makes all things possible," Margaret replied, and she believed it with every fiber of her being. As autumn approached, Margaret began to suspect that their love was about to bear its most precious fruit. She had been feeling unwell in the mornings, and certain foods that she normally enjoyed now made her stomach turn. When she finally confirmed her suspicions with the village doctor, she could barely contain her excitement. She decided to tell Adrian in the library where they had first really talked, where they had first begun to fall in love. She found him there that evening, going over estate accounts by lamplight. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up with the smile that never failed to make her heart skip. "You look like you have a secret," he said, setting aside his papers and pulling her down onto his lap. "I do," Margaret said, suddenly shy. "A wonderful secret." "Tell me," Adrian said, nuzzling her neck in a way that made her shiver. "We are going to have a baby," Margaret whispered. Adrian went very still for a moment, and Margaret held her breath, hoping she had not somehow upset him by bringing up the prospect of another child so soon after they had discussed Thomas. But then Adrian let out a whoop of joy that probably woke half the castle. He stood up so quickly that Margaret had to grab onto him to keep from falling, and then he was spinning her around the library, both of them laughing like children. "A baby," he said, setting her down carefully and placing his hands gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Yes," Margaret said, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased?" Adrian laughed. "Margaret, I am over the moon. I cannot even find words." He kissed her then, deeply and passionately, pouring all his love and excitement into the connection between them. "I was so afraid," he admitted when they finally broke apart. "When I first began to love you, I was terrified that I would lose you like I lost them. But now I understand that love is not about avoiding loss. It is about choosing to love anyway, despite the risk." "And what do you choose?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "I choose love," Adrian said firmly. "I choose you. I choose our child. I choose this life we are building together. I choose all of it, Margaret. The joy and the fear and everything in between." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Adrian proved to be an even more devoted husband than before, if such a thing were possible. He barely let Margaret out of his sight, constantly fussing over her health and comfort in a way that was both touching and occasionally exasperating. "I am with child, not made of glass," Margaret protested one day when he tried to prevent her from walking in the garden. "I know," Adrian said, looking slightly sheepish, "but I cannot help myself. You are carrying the most precious thing in the world." "The second most precious thing," Margaret corrected, placing her hand over his heart. "You are the most precious thing in my world, Adrian Blackthorne." Their daughter was born on a snowy December morning, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced her healthy lungs to anyone within hearing distance. She had Adrian's dark hair and Margaret's blue eyes, and she was the most beautiful thing either of her parents had ever seen. "What shall we call her?" Adrian asked, cradling the tiny bundle with the reverence of a man who had never expected to hold his child again. "Rose," Margaret said without hesitation. "Rose Elizabeth Blackthorne." Adrian's eyes filled with tears at the middle name, a tribute to his first wife that somehow felt absolutely right. "She would have loved that," he said softly. "She would have loved her," Margaret corrected. "Just as Thomas would have loved having a little sister." And as they sat there in their bedchamber, the three of them together for the first time, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a storm, with a desperate woman seeking shelter, and a broken man who had wanted to offer only one night of refuge. But love, Margaret had learned, does not follow the rules we try to set for it. Love takes root where it will, grows in the most unexpected places, and transforms everything it touches. Adrian had said she could stay only one night, but she had stayed forever. Not just in his home, but in his heart. And he had stayed forever in hers as well, healing her loneliness and giving her a purpose she had never dared to dream of. As baby Rose slept peacefully in her father's arms, and snow continued to fall outside the windows of Ravenshollow Castle, Margaret knew that their love story was just beginning. There would be more storms to weather, more challenges to face, more joys to celebrate, but they would face them together, this family they had built from the ashes of tragedy and the hope of new beginnings. And every morning for the rest of their lives, Margaret would wake up grateful for that single night when fate had brought her to Adrian's door. One night had changed everything. One night had given them forever. And if you enjoyed this tale of love conquering fear and hope triumphing over despair, make sure to stay until the very end for more romantic stories that will touch your heart. Like this video, if Margaret and Adrian's journey moved you, and share it with someone who believes in the power of true love, because sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simplest act of kindness, offering shelter to a stranger in the storm.